The alarm inside my private chamber screamed before I even opened my eyes. Red light spilled across the walls of the transport ship, and my hands were already shaking before my mind understood why. I was Velthara Ossen, third daughter of the Ossen Compact, and in exactly 6 hours I was supposed to marry a human commander to stop a war that had already taken more of my people than I could count. But someone had just tried to kill me before I ever reached the altar. The door to my chamber burst open. A guard I did not recognize stood there, his weapon raised, his eyes cold with a hatred I had seen only in soldiers who had lost everyone they loved. Behind him, smoke curled from a scorched wall panel where something had tried to breach the hull near my room. "You will not sell us to the humans," he said, his voice cracked with anger. "Not while I still breathe." I had no weapon. I had no guards of my own yet, because the wedding party had not arrived. All I had was my voice, and in that moment, it was the only thing standing between me and death. "Killing me will not stop the peace," I said, forcing steadiness into my words. "It will only make sure more of our children die for nothing." He hesitated. That hesitation was all the ship's automated defense system needed. A containment field snapped into place around him, locking him in position, and my own guards finally arrived, pulling him away as he shouted that I was a traitor to my own kind. I sat on the edge of my bed after they left, staring at my trembling hands, and asked myself the question that would follow me for the rest of my life. Was I truly saving my people, or was I about to hand them to something far more dangerous than the war itself? 3 cycles earlier, my father had stood before the Compact Council and made an announcement that silenced the entire chamber. Our fleets were failing, not because the humans had better weapons, though their ships were terrifyingly efficient, not because they had greater numbers, because in truth, we still outnumbered them. We were failing because the humans refused to stop. Every time we won a battle, they returned within days with a new strategy, a new formation, a new way to make our victory cost more than it was worth. Our commanders spoke of them in hushed voices, calling them creatures that did not understand the concept of surrender, not even their own. My father proposed a political marriage, a union between our family and their command structure, meant to open a door for peace that neither side could open through combat. I volunteered before anyone else in the room could speak. I told myself it was courage. I told myself it was duty. In truth, I also believed, in the quiet arrogance of youth, that I was clever enough to walk into their world, learn their weaknesses, and use this marriage to strengthen my people's position when the war eventually resumed. I did not believe peace could last. I believed I was being sent as a spy wrapped in a wedding gown. I expected the human commander to be exactly what our propaganda described, a brutal warlord, quick to anger, incapable of mercy, the kind of creature that piloted machines through debris fields without blinking while our people burned. When I finally stood across from Ethan Cross in the ceremonial hall aboard his flagship, nothing about him matched that picture. He was tall, with dark hair beginning to gray at the edges despite looking no older than I was in human years. His uniform was simple, without the excessive decoration our own officers wore to display rank. What struck me most was his voice. Calm, measured. When he spoke his vows, he looked directly into my eyes, and there was no mockery in his expression, no triumph at having won a war bride from a defeated people. There was something closer to sorrow. "I know you did not choose this because you wanted to," he said quietly, after the ceremony ended and the crowd of officials had cleared the hall. "I know what it cost you to stand here. I did not expect kindness. I had prepared myself for cruelty, for arrogance, for 100 different insults I could deflect with practiced grace. Kindness was the one weapon I had no defense against, and it unsettled me more than any threat could have. You mistake my presence for sacrifice," I told him, lifting my chin the way my mother taught me to do when I wanted to appear stronger than I felt. "I am here because it serves my people." "I understand," he said, and something in the way he said it made me feel as though he saw straight through the performance. "I hope, someday, it also serves you." That night, Alone in the quarters assigned to me aboard his ship, I opened a private channel to my father and reported that the human commander seemed weak, sentimental, easy to read, easy to manage. I told him this marriage would work in our favor, that a man who spoke so gently could be guided, softened, eventually convinced to press for terms that benefited the compact far more than his own people. My father's response was brief. He told me to be careful, that gentle men were sometimes the most dangerous, because they had already decided how far they were willing to go, and simply chose not to show it unless they had no other option. I dismissed his warning as an old soldier's paranoia. I was certain I understood exactly what kind of man I had married. I was wrong in ways I could not yet imagine. The days that followed blurred together in a strange, careful rhythm. Officers aboard the ship treated me with a distant, formal politeness that never quite settled into warmth, but never tipped into hostility either. I attended briefings I was not meant to fully understand, meetings where human officials discussed supply routes and diplomatic channels in language stripped of the venom I expected from an enemy speaking about a defeated foe. Nobody gloated, nobody mocked my people's losses. If anything, there was a strange, careful silence whenever the war was mentioned at all, as though it were a subject everyone had silently agreed not to celebrate. I found this more unsettling than open hostility would have been. Hatred I understood. Hatred had rules. This quiet, careful restraint felt like something else entirely, something I did not yet have a name for. On the 5th day, I asked to see the ship's public archive, hoping to find records I could use to understand the true state of human military strength, information my father's advisors could use to plan the compact's next move once this fragile peace inevitably broke down. Ethan granted the request without hesitation, which surprised me. I expected restriction. Instead, I found open access to nearly everything, as though he had nothing to hide, or as though he understood that nothing I found would frighten me the way he already knew it should. I began reading that night, and I did not stop until the ship's systems dimmed the lights to signal the artificial night cycle. What I found were not simple records of ship counts and casualty figures. What I found were histories. Human histories, stretching back centuries before they had ever left their homeworld, filled with conflicts fought entirely against themselves, wars so vast and so relentless that entire regions of their world had been reshaped by them. I read about a species that had turned against its own kind, again and again, refining the art of organized conflict, long before it ever had a single enemy from beyond its own sky. I closed the files that night with a strange, cold feeling settling into my chest, one I could not yet fully explain. It was not fear exactly. It was closer to the sensation of standing at the edge of a cliff in darkness, sensing a drop far deeper than I could see. The following morning, I asked Ethan a question I had been turning over in my mind for hours, unable to set it down. Why did your people never sign the Sentience Accords? I asked him, over a quiet meal in his private quarters, the first time we had shared a meal without an audience of officers watching every word we exchanged. He set down his utensils slowly, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something shift behind his eyes. Not anger. Something more careful than that, something closer to the look a person gives when deciding exactly how much truth someone else is ready to hear. Because every species that signed those accords assumed conflict was something that could be permanently limited, he said finally. My people learned a long time ago that limits only work when everyone involved intends to stop. We were never entirely certain we could promise that, so we chose not to make a promise we might not keep. I sat very still, turning his words over, searching for the arrogance I expected to find beneath them, and finding, instead, something closer to honesty. It was the honesty that frightened me most. That sounds less like strength, I said carefully, testing him, and more like a warning. It is both, he said. It always has been. I wanted to press further, but something in his expression told me the conversation had reached its edge for that day, a door that had opened only slightly, before quietly closing again. I let the silence stretch between us instead, watching him in a new light, no longer seeing the calm, gentle man I had assumed I understood on the day we married. I saw instead the faint outline of something far larger standing quietly behind that calm, something patient and enormous that had simply chosen, for now, not to move. That night, for the first time since arriving aboard his ship, I did not send a report to my father claiming I had found weakness to exploit. I sat alone in the dark, staring at the stars beyond the viewport, and allowed myself to consider, for the very first time, that I might have walked into something far larger than a simple political marriage. I had come here believing I was clever enough to manage a man I assumed was gentle because he lacked strength. I was beginning to understand that his gentleness was not the absence of strength at all. It was strength, deliberately restrained, and I did not yet know what it would take to make that restraint end. I thought, foolishly, that I had time to learn the answer slowly, carefully, on my own terms. I did not yet know that within days, a plot forming within my own family's ranks would force that answer into the open far sooner than I was prepared for, and that when it did, I would finally understand exactly why no empire in the known galaxy had ever dared to push humanity past the edge of its patience. The station where the Peace Summit was being held sat at the edge of neutral space, a massive ring of metal and glass built specifically for this fragile new alliance, and the moment I stepped off the transport, I felt eyes on me from every direction. Delegates from a dozen worlds moved through the corridors, some curious, some wary, all of them watching the woman who had married into the species everyone quietly feared. Ethan walked beside me, his hand resting lightly near my back without ever quite touching me, a gesture I later learned was meant to signal to everyone watching that I was under his protection without making a public display of it. I found myself grateful for that restraint, more than I expected to be. They stare at you as if you are a curiosity from a market stall, I said quietly as we passed a group of Trellan diplomats who quickly looked away. They stare because they are trying to decide if the war truly ended, Ethan replied. A marriage is easy to announce. It is harder to believe. I understood that better than he realized. I had been trying to decide the same thing myself since the ceremony. Our first days at the station were filled with meetings I mostly observed rather than participated in. Careful negotiations over trade routes, prisoner exchanges, and border boundaries that had shifted so many times during the war that even the official maps disagreed with each other. I watched Ethan navigate these discussions with a patience that never once cracked, even when compact representatives raised their voices, even when accusations of past cruelty were thrown across the table by both sides. It was during one of these sessions that I first met Counselor Edmund Voss, a senior human diplomat with sharp eyes and a reputation, I later learned, for being one of the few people who had served through every major conflict humanity had fought since leaving their homeworld. He watched me with open curiosity during a break in negotiations, finally approaching while Ethan was occupied elsewhere. "You have questions," Voss said simply, without any of the polite preamble I expected. "I can see them sitting behind your eyes every time someone mentions the accords your people wanted us to sign." "Everyone deflects when I ask," I admitted, deciding honesty might work better than diplomacy, with a man who clearly valued neither. "Even my husband." Voss allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Ethan deflects because he is trying to protect you from something. I am old enough that I no longer see the point in protecting people from truth. It rarely works, and it always costs more in the end." "Then tell me," I said, "why does everyone fear what my people call a limited response? Why does even the mention of your homeworld's history make compact officers grow quiet?" Voss glanced around the room before answering, as though even now, surrounded by allies, old habits of caution refused to fully release him. "Because we do not fight the way your people fight," he said. "Your compact, and every other empire we have encountered, treats conflict as a transaction. You calculate losses, you calculate gains, and when the balance tips unfavorably, you withdraw and negotiate. It is a rational system. It has kept your civilization stable for a very long time. And humanity does not calculate this way?" I asked. "We do, for a while," Voss said. But my people have a long history of reaching a point where the calculation stops mattering, a point where the question is no longer what we can afford to lose, but simply what we intend to finish. Every species that has fought us has eventually discovered that point exists. Most of them discovered it too late to change course. I felt a chill settle over me that had nothing to do with the station's climate controls. What happens when you reach that point? Voss studied me for a long moment before answering, his expression unreadable. I hope, for your sake, and for the sake of everyone at this summit, that you never have to find out firsthand. I have seen it twice in my lifetime. I do not wish to see it a third time. He excused himself shortly after, leaving me standing alone with a question that had grown heavier rather than lighter, and a feeling that I had been given only the outline of a truth far larger than I was prepared to hold. That evening, I returned to the private quarters we shared aboard the station and found Ethan reviewing reports at a small desk near the viewport, his expression tired in a way I had not seen since our wedding day. I told him about my conversation with Voss, watching carefully for his reaction. He set down the datapad slowly and rubbed a hand across his face before speaking. Edmund has never been good at softening things. I suppose I should be grateful he told you something true rather than something comfortable. Then it is true, I said. This point he described. This place your people reach where calculation no longer matters. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the stars beyond the viewport, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before. Every species measures strength differently, he said. Your people measure it in ships, in territory, in resources held. We learned, a long time ago, on our own world, fighting each other long before we ever met anyone else among the stars, that the deepest strength a people can have is the willingness to continue past the point where continuing seems to make sense. It is not something we are proud of, it is simply something that is true about us, the way gravity is true, whether we wish it to be or not. And this marriage, I said carefully, this peace we are building here, at this summit, is it built on hope, or is it built on my people finally understanding this truth about yours? Both, I think, he said. I married you hoping we would never need the second part to matter. I have spent every day since trying to make sure we never do. I studied him in the dim light of the quarters, this man I had once dismissed as gentle and therefore weak, and felt the last of that assumption finally crumble away completely. He was not weak, he had simply decided, deliberately, every single day, to hold something enormous perfectly still, and I was only now beginning to understand the effort that decision required. 3 days later, the summit reached its most difficult session yet, a discussion over disputed border colonies that both the Compact and a neighboring empire called the Threll Dominion claimed as their own. Tensions in the room grew sharp enough that I could feel them pressing against my skin like static before a storm. Compact representatives argued their historical claim with increasing volume, while Threll delegates countered with accusations of expansion built on conquest rather than settlement. I watched my own people's representatives, led by a cousin of mine named Castor Vrel, grow increasingly agitated, his voice rising with a kind of righteous anger I recognized from my youngest years, when the war was young and victory still seemed close enough to touch. I had not seen Castor since before my wedding, and something in his eyes now, a hard, brittle edge that had not been there before, unsettled me before he ever spoke a single word directly to me. During a break in the session, Castor approached me in a quiet corridor away from the main chamber, his expression carefully neutral in a way that felt rehearsed rather than natural. "Cousin," he said, inclining his head just slightly, "it is good to see you well. The Compact worried, when word first arrived that you had left with the humans." "I am well," I said carefully, sensing something beneath the polite words that I could not yet name. "The negotiations are progressing. Peace is closer than it has ever been." Castor's smile did not reach his eyes. "Peace," he repeated, as though tasting a word he found bitter. "Is that truly what you believe this is? Or have you simply grown comfortable enough in your new husband's shadow that surrender has begun to feel like victory?" The words struck harder than I expected, not because they were true, but because I recognized the anger behind them, the same anger I had once carried myself before I understood what I now understood. "This is not surrender," I said firmly. "This is survival." I would think you, of all people, would understand the difference after everything the war has cost us. "I understand exactly what it has cost us," Castor said, his voice dropping low and cold. "I understand it well enough to know that some of us are not willing to let that cost be erased by a marriage arranged to make defeat feel like diplomacy." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing back toward the main chamber, leaving me standing alone in the corridor, with a growing unease I could not shake for the rest of the day. I told myself it was simply old grief speaking, the bitterness of a man who had lost friends and family to a war he still could not fully let go of. I did not yet understand that his words were not simply grief. They were a warning, delivered carelessly, of something already set into motion that would soon threaten to unravel everything Ethan and I had spent these fragile weeks trying to build. That night, unable to sleep, I walked the quiet observation deck alone, watching the distant stars and turning Castor's words over in my mind again and again. I did not yet know how close he stood to danger, or how close I stood to losing the peace I had begun, despite myself, to genuinely want to protect. I only knew, standing there in the silence, that something in the careful balance of this summit had begun to shift, and that whatever came next would test everything I had learned about the quiet, patient strength of the man I had married for duty and was slowly beginning to understand for entirely different reasons. I could not sleep that night, and instead of returning to our quarters, I found myself walking toward the station's small research archive, a quiet room few delegates ever visited, filled with records both public and half-forgotten. I told myself I was simply looking for a distraction from Castor's words. In truth, I think some part of me already sensed that the answers I needed would not come from casual conversation, but from the histories themselves, the ones nobody wanted to fully explain out loud. The archive terminal recognized my clearance as a spouse of the human delegation and granted me access to records I had not yet seen, deeper layers of history than the public files Ethan had shown me during our first days aboard his ship. I began reading, and within the hour, I understood why Voss had chosen his words so carefully, and why Ethan had chosen to say so little at all. The early records were almost gentle by comparison. Simple accounts of humanity's earliest conflicts on their homeworld, wars fought over land, over resources, over ideas that seemed, from the safe distance of centuries, almost small. But the records did not stay small. As I moved further through the archive, I found accounts of conflicts that grew in scale far beyond anything my own people's history contained. Wars that consumed entire regions of their homeworld, not once, but twice, within a single century. Wars fought not between empires and outsiders, but between humanity and itself, with a ferocity and persistence that seemed, to my eyes, almost impossible to sustain. What struck me most was not the scale of these conflicts, though the numbers alone were staggering enough to leave me sitting motionless before the terminal for long minutes at a time. What struck me was the pattern. Every account described a species that, when pushed toward defeat, simply refused the outcome. Not through denial, but through a grim, methodical refusal to accept that the fight was over. A refusal that had, time and again throughout their history, turned certain defeat into eventual victory, regardless of the cost required to get there. I found a passage describing an early human historian's reflection on this pattern, written long before humanity had ever left their homeworld, long before they had any reason to imagine that pattern would one day be observed by an entirely different species from the stars. The historian had written that humanity's greatest strength and its greatest danger were the same trait, worn differently depending on the moment. A species that did not know how to stop, the historian wrote, was a terrifying thing to stand beside in a crisis, and an even more terrifying thing to stand against in a conflict. I sat back from the terminal, my hands trembling slightly, and thought of Ethan's calm, careful voice describing this same trait to me only days earlier. He had called it a truth about his people, the way gravity is a truth, whether anyone wished it to be or not. I understood now why he had chosen those words so precisely. I continued reading, moving from ancient history into more recent records, searching for the first contact between humanity and the wider galaxy, hoping to understand how this pattern had carried forward once humanity finally left their homeworld behind. What I found unsettled me even more than the ancient conflicts had. Humanity's first true encounter with organized hostility from another species had not been with my people. It had been with an empire long since collapsed, a proud and ancient civilization called the Koran Ascendancy, which the wider galaxy still spoke of only in cautious, careful terms, as a cautionary tale rather than a history lesson. The records described the Ascendancy as one of the oldest and most powerful empires known at the time, commanding fleets that dwarfed anything humanity possessed in those early years of expansion. The Ascendancy had viewed humanity's small, scattered colonies as an easy target, a young species barely capable of defending its own borders, and had launched what their own records described as a campaign of correction, intended to bring humanity's expansion under the Ascendancy's control before it could grow into a genuine rival. For the first several months of that conflict, the records showed exactly what the Ascendancy expected. Human colonies fell, human fleets retreated. By every rational measure, the outcome of that war should have been decided within a single cycle. But the retreats did not become surrender. Instead, according to records pieced together from multiple surviving accounts, something shifted within humanity's response after the loss of a colony called New Meridian, a settlement that had held no strategic value beyond the families who lived there. I found an old transcript, translated and archived by a historian from a neutral species who had studied the conflict decades later, describing the moment the wider galaxy first began to understand what humanity truly was. The transcript described a message broadcast from the human command structure to the Ascendancy leadership shortly after the loss of that colony, a message that contained no threats, no demands, and no anger. It simply stated, in calm and measured language, that humanity understood the Ascendancy believed this conflict could be ended through cost. It stated that humanity intended to demonstrate, patiently and thoroughly, exactly how wrong that belief was. What followed, according to every surviving account, was not a war fought for territory or resources. It was a war fought entirely to prove a single point, conducted with a chilling, methodical patience that the Ascendancy's own historians, in records recovered long after their empire's eventual collapse, described as unlike anything they had encountered in their long history of conflict. Humanity did not seek to conquer the Ascendancy's worlds. They simply made the cost of continuing the conflict rise, steadily and relentlessly, refusing every offer of negotiated peace that did not include a complete and permanent withdrawal from human space, for as long as it took the Ascendancy's own leadership to conclude that no acceptable outcome remained available to them. The war lasted 6 years. The Ascendancy, an empire that had stood for over 1,000 years before that conflict began, formally dissolved less than 2 decades after its conclusion, unable to recover the strength and unity it had held before the war began. Humanity, meanwhile, absorbed none of the Ascendancy's territory, made no demands for reparations beyond the return of captured colonies, and simply returned to the quiet work of expanding their own small, scattered worlds, as though the entire conflict had been nothing more than a lesson delivered and then set aside. I read that final detail 3 times before I fully understood its weight. Humanity had not wanted the Ascendancy's territory. They had not wanted glory, or revenge, or expansion. They had wanted, simply, to prove that the cost of underestimating them would always exceed whatever gain an enemy hoped to achieve, and once that point had been proven beyond any possible doubt, they had stopped, without hesitation, exactly as calmly as they had begun. I closed the archive terminal and sat alone in the quiet room for a long time, trying to reconcile this history with the gentle, careful man I had married, the man who had asked, rather than demanded, when the marriage contract was first proposed to him, the man whose hand rested so lightly near my back that I sometimes forgot it was there at all. I understood now that his gentleness was not separate from the history I had just read. It was, in a strange and unsettling way, a direct result of it. A man who understood exactly what his people were capable of, had every reason in the world to move through every other moment of his life, as carefully and as gently as he possibly could. I thought of my own people's war against humanity, the war this marriage was meant to end, and felt a cold, creeping realization settle into my chest. We had believed, throughout the entire conflict, that humanity's continued resistance was a sign of desperation, a species fighting past the point of reasonable strength because they had no other choice available to them. I understood now that this belief had been entirely, dangerously wrong. Humanity had not been fighting past the point of reasonable strength. They had simply not yet reached the point where the calculations stopped mattering to them, the point Voss had warned me about, the point Ethan had described as a truth about his people, as certain and unavoidable as gravity itself. We had been closer to that point than any of us in the Compact's leadership had ever understood, and the ceasefire that led to this marriage had not been a sign of humanity's exhaustion, as our own commanders had reported to the Council. It had been, I now understood with a clarity that left me feeling suddenly, deeply small, an act of restraint. A choice, deliberately made, to stop before reaching a threshold that history suggested very few civilizations ever recovered from once crossed. I left the archive and made my way back through the quiet, sleeping corridors of the station toward our shared quarters, my mind turning over question after question I did not yet know how to ask out loud. When I arrived, I found Ethan still awake, seated near the viewport exactly as I had left him hours earlier, though the datapad in his hands had long since gone dark. "You found the ascendancy records," he said quietly, without turning to look at me, as though he had somehow known exactly where my restless mind would eventually lead me. "How did you know?" I asked, moving to sit across from him, studying his face in the dim light for some sign of the vast, careful restraint I now understood lived quietly beneath his calm exterior. "Because everyone eventually finds them," he said. "Every delegate, every diplomat, every spouse who marries into our command structure the way you did. Sooner or later, the questions lead there, and once they do, the questions never quite stop." "Why did you not simply tell me, from the beginning?" I asked, and I heard, to my own surprise, something closer to hurt than accusation in my voice. Ethan finally turned to look at me, and the expression on his face was not defensive, but tired, in a way that made him seem, for the first time since I had known him, genuinely vulnerable. "Because I did not want you to marry a warning," he said. "I wanted you to marry a person. I hoped, foolishly perhaps, that if I gave you time, you would come to understand both, in the order that mattered most to me." I sat with his words for a long moment, feeling the sharp edges of my earlier hurt begin to soften into something more complicated, something closer to understanding. "And which order was that?" I asked quietly. "The person first," he said, "always the person first. The rest is simply history we carry, whether we want to or not. It does not have to be the only thing you see when you look at me." I thought of Castor's bitter words in the corridor only hours earlier, of the anger I had recognized in his eyes, the same anger that history suggested had, time and again, led entire empires toward conflicts they could never hope to win. I thought of the careful, patient man sitting across from me now, who had spent every day of our brief marriage trying to be seen as exactly that, a person, rather than a warning carried quietly behind gentle eyes. "I see both," I told him honestly. "I do not think I can unsee either one now, but I understand, better than I did this morning, why you have spent every day since our wedding trying so carefully to hold yourself so still." Ethan reached across the small space between us and took my hand, his grip gentle but sure, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, the silence between us filled with something that felt, despite everything I had just learned, remarkably close to trust. "I am glad you understand," he said finally, "because I fear, very soon, we may both need that stillness more than we ever have before." I did not yet know how right he was. I did not yet know that even as we sat together in that quiet room, my cousin Castor and a faction of compact loyalists who shared his bitterness had already begun setting into motion a plan that would test, within days, exactly how far that careful, patient restraint could bend before it finally, inevitably, broke. 3 days after my visit to the archive, the summit reached its final stretch of negotiations, and a strange, cautious optimism had begun to settle over the station. Delegates who had spent the first weeks eyeing each other with open suspicion had started speaking, however carefully, about the shape a lasting peace might actually take. I allowed myself, for the first time since arriving, to believe that the marriage might truly accomplish what my father had hoped for, that the war might end not through exhaustion, but through something closer to genuine understanding. That fragile optimism shattered in the middle of the night, when an emergency alert tore through the station and every light in our quarters snapped from soft evening amber to hard alarm red. Ethan was on his feet before I had even fully processed the sound, already moving toward the door with the kind of controlled urgency I had never seen from him before, calm still, but sharpened now into something with a clear and immediate purpose. "Stay here," he said, though even as he said it, I was already reaching for my outer robe, unwilling to be left behind, not knowing what threatened the fragile peace we had spent weeks building. "Tell me what is happening," I said, following him into the corridor despite his warning. "An unregistered vessel breached the station's outer perimeter," he said, his voice tight with a focus that made my stomach twist with dread. "It is broadcasting a modified signature designed to look like one of ours." The words landed like a physical blow. "Designed to look like one of yours," I repeated slowly, already understanding, with a sick, sinking certainty, exactly what that meant. Someone wanted this to look like a human attack. We reached the station's command center within minutes, where officers from multiple delegations had already gathered, tension crackling through the room like static before a storm. On the main display, a small, fast vessel moved through the station's outer corridors, its markings deliberately altered, its flight pattern erratic, in a way that suggested either panic or a deliberate attempt to draw attention. "It is heading toward the summit's central hall," a young officer reported, her voice clipped with barely controlled fear. "If it reaches the delegates before we can intercept, and its signature reads as human origin, every non-human delegation in that room will believe humanity has broken the ceasefire in the middle of a peace summit." I felt the blood drain from my face as the full shape of the plan became clear to me. This was not a simple attack. This was a trap, designed precisely to reignite the war at its most fragile, most symbolic moment, framed in a way that would make humanity appear to be the aggressor, and I understood, with a horror that settled deep into my bones, exactly whose bitterness had likely inspired it. "Castor," I said quietly, and Ethan turned to look at me sharply. "Explain," he said, his voice still calm, but with an edge beneath it now that I had never heard before. I told him quickly about the corridor conversation days earlier, about the bitterness in my cousin's eyes, about the accusation that this peace was nothing more than dressed-up surrender. I watched Ethan's expression shift as I spoke, not toward anger, but toward something colder and more focused, a stillness that felt, for the first time since I had known him, genuinely dangerous. "Get eyes on every compact vessel that departed our fleet registry in the last 72 hours, he said to the officers around him, his voice never rising, though the command in it left no room for hesitation. "I want to know who authorized that vessel's modifications before this station's shields are breached any further." The room moved into motion around us, officers coordinating with a precision that spoke of long practice, and I stood at the center of it feeling suddenly, terribly useless, watching a crisis unfold that my own family had likely set into motion. I thought of my father's warning, delivered so long ago it felt like another lifetime, about gentle men who had already decided how far they were willing to go. I understood now, watching Ethan's focused stillness, exactly what that warning had meant. Within minutes, the vessel's flight path was intercepted by station security, forced into a docking bay far from the summit's central hall, its crew detained before they could complete whatever final step their plan required. The immediate danger passed, but the damage, I quickly realized, was not so easily contained. Word of the incident had already spread through the station's communication channels faster than security could control it, and by the time the sun cycle reset to its artificial morning, every delegation at the summit had heard some version of the story, most of them incomplete, many of them already twisted into something far more dangerous than the truth. I found Ethan in a small briefing room shortly after dawn, surrounded by tense officers reviewing footage from the intercepted vessel, and the moment I saw his face, I understood that whatever calm resolve had carried him through the night had begun, finally, to fray at its edges. The vessel's origin traces back to a private shipyard within compact territory, he said without preamble, seeing me enter. Registered under a holding company connected, through several careful layers, to your cousin's household. I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of confirmation I had already suspected, but had not truly allowed myself to believe until this moment. What happens now? I asked quietly. That depends, Ethan said, on whether your cousin intends to continue what he started, or whether last night's failure was enough to make him reconsider. Within the hour, we received our answer, delivered not through diplomatic channels, but through a private, unencrypted message broadcast openly enough that half the delegations at the summit intercepted it within minutes. Castor's voice filled the briefing room, steady and cold, addressed not to Ethan, but to the compact delegation and to every non-human observer present at the summit. The peace being offered here is not peace, his recorded voice declared. It is surrender, dressed carefully enough that our own leadership has mistaken it for victory. I acted last night to reveal the truth of what humanity is capable of, and I will act again, until every empire watching this summit understands exactly what is being asked of them by continuing to negotiate with a species that has never once shown restraint when its true strength was finally tested. The message ended, and silence fell heavily over the room. I felt every eye present turn, however briefly, toward me, and understood, with a fresh wave of cold dread, that my own family's name was now directly tied to an act designed to provoke exactly the kind of response Castor claimed to already fear. He wants a reaction, Ethan said quietly, breaking the silence, his eyes fixed on the now dark display where the message had played. He wants every delegation in this room to see humanity respond with force, because he believes that response will finally convince the wider galaxy that the history he fears is still true today, that this marriage, this peace, is nothing more than a temporary pause before the pattern repeats itself. Is he wrong? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, born from every fear the archive records had planted in me only days earlier. Ethan turned to look at me then, and for the first time since the crisis began, something in his expression softened, just slightly, enough to let me see past the focused stillness to the man underneath it. I do not yet know, he said honestly. I know what my instincts are telling me to do. I know what history suggests my people are capable of when pushed toward the point where restraint stops feeling worth the cost. I also know that every choice I make in the next few hours will decide whether that history repeats itself, or whether it finally, truly changes. He turned back to his officers, and I watched him make a decision that surprised nearly everyone in that room, myself included. Rather than authorizing a show of force against Castor's remaining supporters, rather than moving human fleets into a defensive posture that every delegation present would surely interpret as preparation for renewed conflict, Ethan requested a direct, open channel to Castor himself, broadcast publicly, exactly as Castor's own message had been. "What are you doing?" I asked quietly, watching the technicians prepare the connection. "Giving him exactly what he claims to want," Ethan said. "A choice, made openly, in front of everyone watching. Not a demand, not a show of force. A question." The channel opened, and Castor's face appeared on the display, tense and defiant, clearly surprised by the calm, measured tone with which Ethan addressed him rather than the anger he had likely expected and perhaps even hoped for. "You believe," Ethan said, his voice carrying clearly through the room and, I knew, through every delegation's monitors across the station, that the only way to reveal the truth about my people is to force us into a response you can point to as proof. I am not going to give you that response. Instead, I am going to ask you, directly, in front of everyone watching this exchange, to stand down, return to compact territory, and answer for what you have done through the peace process you claim to distrust so completely." Castor's expression flickered, uncertainty briefly breaking through his defiance before he forced it back beneath a hardened mask. "And if I refuse," he asked, "then you will have proven something," Ethan said quietly, "though not what you intended. You will have proven that my people can be provoked, threatened, and even directly attacked, and still choose to ask, rather than to strike, for as long as any path toward peace remains open. I would rather you prove that than the alternative you are hoping for." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I found myself holding my breath, watching Castor's face across the display, searching for some sign of which way this fragile moment might finally break. I thought of everything I had learned in the archive days earlier, the Ascendancy's collapse, the calm, methodical patience that had once turned a losing war into an empire's final ending, and understood, with a clarity that steadied something deep within me, exactly how much was resting on the choice my cousin was about to make. "You would have me believe," Castor finally said, his voice quieter now, some of its earlier defiance beginning to crack beneath the weight of Ethan's calm, unwavering restraint. "That restraint is strength, rather than weakness dressed in careful words." "I would have you believe nothing," Ethan said. "I am simply asking you to choose, honestly, what you actually want the outcome of today to be, not what you believe it should prove about my people, what you actually want for your own people, going forward." I watched my cousin's face across that display, and for the first time since this crisis began, I saw something shift behind his eyes, the hard, brittle edge of his anger finally giving way, if only slightly, to something closer to exhaustion, the same exhaustion I remembered from every soldier I had ever known who had carried this war for far too long. He did not answer immediately. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncertain, and I understood that whatever came next would decide far more than the fate of one bitter, grieving man. It would decide whether the history I had read in that quiet archive room was truly, finally, beginning to change, or whether it was about to repeat itself in front of every delegation gathered to witness the very peace it threatened to destroy. Castor's silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, though I knew, watching the display, that it could only have been a matter of seconds. His eyes moved briefly away from the camera, as though searching for something, or someone, off-screen, and I found myself wondering whether he was alone in whatever room he now occupied, or whether other compact loyalists stood just beyond the frame, waiting to see which way his answer would fall. "I want this war to have meant something," he finally said, his voice rough, stripped now of the cold defiance it had carried only minutes earlier. "I want the people we lost to have died for a reason that still matters, rather than fading into a footnote in a peace nobody truly believes will last." Ethan's expression did not harden at this admission. If anything, something in it softened further, and when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the careful authority of a commander addressing a criminal, but something closer to the quiet understanding of one grieving person speaking to another. "They will have meant something," he said, "not because the war continues, but because it finally stops, and stops in a way that makes certain no one else has to join the list of names we are both still carrying. That is a harder thing to build than a battle. It is also, I believe, the only outcome that actually honors what those losses cost you." Castor closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, something had settled behind his expression, a decision made, though clearly not an easy one. "I will return to compact space," he said quietly. "I will answer for what I authorized. I ask only that whatever judgment follows, falls on me, and not on the people who followed my orders, believing they were defending something worth defending. "That is a request I can carry to the council myself," Ethan said, and something in his tone made clear this was not a small concession, but a genuine promise, one I understood he intended to keep regardless of what it cost him politically among his own people. "Thank you for choosing this, Castor. I mean that honestly." The channel closed, and the room around us seemed to exhale all at once, tension breaking loose in a dozen small, quiet ways. Officers lowering shoulders that had been tensed for hours, quiet murmurs of relief passing between people who had spent the entire night bracing for a very different outcome. I felt my own knees weaken slightly, the adrenaline that had carried me through the crisis finally beginning to fade, leaving something closer to exhaustion in its place. Ethan turned to me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke, simply standing together amid the quiet aftermath, the weight of everything that had almost happened settling slowly between us. "You could have ordered a stronger response," I said finally, breaking the silence. "Every officer in this room expected it. I think, if I am honest, some part of me expected it as well." "I know," Ethan said quietly. "I considered it. Every instinct my people carry, every lesson history has taught us about what happens when restraint is tested too far, told me to answer force with overwhelming force, to make absolutely certain no one watching ever considered testing us this way again." "Then why did you not?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I had come to recognize over these past weeks, the look of a man carefully weighing exactly how much truth to share. "Because I have read the same history you found in that archive," he said finally. "I know what it cost the Ascendancy to test my people past that point. I also know it cost us something too, something quieter, something that does not appear in the official records, but that every soldier who lived through it still carries. Winning that war did not undo what fighting it required of us. I did not want that cost paid again, not when there was still a path available that did not require it. I thought of Voss's careful warning weeks earlier, his admission that he had witnessed this pattern twice in his lifetime and hoped never to witness it a third time. I understood now, standing in the quiet aftermath of a crisis that had come so close to reigniting an entire war, that this hope was not simply Voss's alone. It belonged to every human I had met since arriving, worn quietly beneath careful diplomacy and patient restraint, a hope that this time, finally, the pattern might be broken before it ever needed to repeat itself. News of Castor's surrender and his voluntary return to compact territory spread quickly through the summit in the days that followed, and the effect it had on the wider negotiations surprised me more than almost anything else that had happened since my arrival. Delegations that had spent the crisis bracing for evidence of humanity's dangerous capacity instead witnessed something else entirely, a demonstration of restraint so deliberate, so carefully chosen even in the face of direct provocation, that it seemed to shift the entire tone of the summit's remaining sessions. I overheard fragments of conversation among delegates from half a dozen different empires in the days that followed, quiet, uncertain discussions about what they had witnessed, and I began to understand something I had not fully grasped before. The fear that surrounded humanity across the wider galaxy had never truly been about their capacity for conflict alone. Every major empire possessed fleets capable of terrible destruction. What set humanity apart, what had made every other species in the known galaxy quietly, carefully avoid testing them too far, was the uncertainty of exactly where their limits sat, combined now with fresh, undeniable evidence that they were capable of holding that limit back even when directly provoked, even when every rational calculation suggested a stronger response would have been justified. An empire that responded to every provocation with overwhelming force was, in a strange way, easier to predict, and therefore easier to manage. An empire that chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to hold immense capability in careful reserve was something far harder to calculate, and I began to understand, watching the shift in the summit's remaining negotiations, that this uncertainty itself had become one of humanity's greatest sources of quiet, unspoken respect, across a galaxy that had spent generations fearing them for entirely different reasons. On the final day of the summit, as delegations began finalizing the terms of a peace that, only days earlier, had come dangerously close to collapsing entirely, I found myself standing beside Ethan on a quiet observation deck overlooking the assembled fleets. Ships from a dozen different empires gathered peacefully in the same space for the first time since the war began. "You once told me," I said, watching the distant lights of the fleets drifting slowly against the stars, "that you married a person, not a warning. I think I finally understand what you meant." "And what is that?" he asked, turning to look at me with an expression I had come to know well over these past weeks. Patient, attentive, genuinely curious about my answer, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "I came here believing I was clever enough to use this marriage to strengthen my people's position for a war I assumed would eventually resume," I admitted, the confession easier to make now than I ever expected it would be. "I believed peace was a temporary pause, a strategy, rather than a genuine possibility. I understand now that I was wrong, not because your people are incapable of the history I read in that archive, but because that history is not the whole truth of who you are. It is simply the truth of what you are capable of becoming, if pushed far enough. The rest of that truth, the part that matters just as much, is the choice you make every single day not to become it, for as long as any other path remains open." Ethan reached over and took my hand, his grip warm and steady, and for a long moment we simply stood together in silence, watching the fleets of a dozen different empires drift peacefully beneath the stars, empires that had spent generations fearing humanity for reasons I finally, fully understood. "That choice is not always easy," he said quietly. "It was not easy 3 nights ago, watching that ship breach our perimeter, knowing exactly what my people are capable of if I gave a different order. It will not always be easy in the years ahead, whatever challenges this fragile peace still faces. But I would rather spend every difficult day making that choice than spend a single day living in the aftermath of having made the other one." I thought of Castor, returning now to face judgment from his own people, carrying grief that a war's ending could not fully heal, but that this peace, fragile as it was, might finally allow him to begin carrying differently. I thought of Voss, his tired eyes carrying the weight of having witnessed this pattern twice before, and the quiet hope I now understood lived beneath his careful warnings. I thought of my father, who had sent me into this marriage believing it might save our people, never fully understanding, perhaps, exactly what it would teach me about the species he had asked me to marry into. I had come here believing I understood strength, believing it could be measured in fleets and territory, and the willingness to fight without hesitation. I understood now that I had been measuring the wrong thing entirely. The true strength I had found here, standing beside a man who had chosen restraint even when every instinct and every history told him restraint might not be enough, was not the absence of danger. It was the deliberate, daily choice to hold that danger carefully in reserve, out of respect for exactly how much it could cost everyone involved if it were ever allowed to fully wake. That I finally understood, standing on that quiet observation deck, as the peace we had fought so hard to protect finally, truly began to hold, was the answer to the question that had followed me since the very first night of this marriage. No empire in the known galaxy dared to challenge humanity too far, not simply because of what they were capable of when finally pushed past their limit, but because every other species who had ever tested that limit had learned, at devastating cost, that humanity's true strength was never the war itself. It was the quiet, patient restraint that came before it, held for as long as humanly possible, offered again and again to anyone willing to accept it. Right up until the very last moment, restraint remained a choice at all. I had married a human to end a war, believing, in my youth and my arrogance, that I understood exactly what that meant. I understood now that I had married into something far larger than a simple peace treaty, something that would shape not only the remainder of my own life, but quite possibly the future of every empire that had ever quietly, carefully feared what might happen if humanity's patience were ever fully spent. Standing there beside Ethan, watching the fleets of a dozen worlds drift peacefully together beneath the same stars that had once witnessed our war, I finally allowed myself to believe, completely and without reservation, that this peace might truly last. Not because humanity had been made harmless by love or diplomacy or the careful architecture of a summit years in the making, but because they had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, in the moments that mattered most, to be exactly as gentle as the galaxy needed them to be, while never once forgetting, and never once allowing anyone else to forget, precisely what that gentleness was, quietly, carefully choosing to hold back.